All right, so I guess for anyone who came late, I'm Alex Libby, and I work with Tim Bushman at Princeton. And again, thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk at your journal club. And I completely agree with what you're saying. I'm very interested in neural computation and how um, the brain basically stores information and manipulates it over time. And I think for me, I'd like to get at those questions at the circuit level. Um, you might find these population dynamics in your neural networks, but I also want to understand sort of what's going on sort of a step lower and looking at the cells that are making up that activity. And that's basically what this project is about. So I guess you guys all read the paper. If not, don't worry, because I'm going to go through it. Rotational dynamics reduce interference between sensory and memory representations. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is I think that predictions are sort of the most central part of any computation. And of course, my view is somewhat biased, but the reason I think this is because I believe they represent the brain's ability to maintain the statistics of the environment. And this is useful because it lets us deal with noisy information. It helps us draw connections between ideas. And this basically allows us to think. It allows us to respond quickly. And I would argue also be creative. But as an introduction, I'm going to use a really simple example that I used in cosine, I guess like 2 years ago, 1 year ago, which is just watching any sports game. It doesn't have to be tennis, but here we have events occurring in a sequence. Okay, so you're just passively processing something and it seems really simple, but actually you're doing several things at once. You're processing the immediate sensory events, where the players are, where the ball is, but you're also remembering the past. And the past is the long-term past. So whatever you know about the player, maybe they're injured, maybe they have a specific playing style. And also the immediate past. Where was the player just on the court? And like maybe what did their swing look like before they hit the ball? And this allows you to learn the important transition probabilities between the events of the game. And so that's what leads you to learn predictions, and it really gives you optimal sensory processing. So let's get back to the neuroscience question, which is, how is the brain doing all of this at once? And more specifically, how does the brain preserve short-term memory during sequential processing? So to get at this question, we used data from this implicit sequence learning paradigm, which was designed to create learnable predictions. And so the animals are listening to sequences of sounds, and some sequences are more common than others. So each sequence starts with a context, for example, A, B, where A is always followed by B and most frequently by C. And these are expected sequences, and they occur about 68% of the time. And on an unexpected trial, you might hear AB followed by C prime, and those occur 20% of the time. So if you do the math, you'll notice 12% of the trials are missing, and this is because those were ambiguous stimuli, and I'm not analyzing those here, but we can talk about them offline if you want. So I wanted to create a paradigm where basically I didn't want the animal to know that like C occurred more often. So that is why we added the second context. So here, X is always followed by Y, and it predicts instead C prime, and is rarely followed by C. So every sequence starts with a context, either A, B, or X, Y, and is followed by a predicted stimulus, C or C prime. So the expected conditions are A, B, C, D, and X, Y, C prime D. And the unexpected conditions are A, B, C prime D, and X, Y, C, D. And I know it's a lot to remember, so whenever it's important, I'll remind you which are expected and unexpected. For now, I just want you to appreciate that it's a balanced paradigm. So the animal never knows whether it's going to hear A or B, or A or X, because they occur equally per day. And as do C and C prime. So until the animal hears the first sound, it doesn't know if it's going to hear C or C prime. Now, like I said, we want to understand how the brain does this. How does the cortex represent sensory information, the predictions within the sequence, and also what happened at the beginning of the sequence? So to get at this question, I recorded from 7 awake mice, and I used silicon probes that I implanted in auditory cortex. And basically, the animals are listening to these sequences, and they're sort of, it's like one block where all the sequences are sort of randomly played. So the animal might hear one and then another. It's not like all the A trials are together or something like that. And so this paradigm doesn't have a behavior. And one of the reasons that I think I wanted that was because I wanted to study learning, and I wanted the animals to be completely naive to the sounds before the animals heard them. So on day 1, they've never heard the sounds before, and then by day 4, they're really well experienced hearing the sequences. Okay, so basically what we want to capture in the neural activity is how A predicts C, and likewise how X predicts C prime. So how is that associative learning represented in the neural activity? So when I'm talking about a neural representation, basically it comes down to the firing rate responses to the stimulus. So if we look at A versus X, I can take an example neuron and look at the firing rate response over the course of the sequence. So here I'm grouping trials by whether the animal heard A, shown in purple, or X, shown in green. And for all of these analyses, I always balance across trial types to prevent any biasing. So this example neuron, you can see, has a higher firing rate to X trials and lower to A. But overall, basically, we want to understand how the entire population represents that AX stimulus. So that is why we built the AX classifier. So we take all of the neurons and their responses to these trial types. We take the average firing rate during the very beginning of the sequence when A or X is played, and we build a linear classifier to distinguish between the responses to A versus X trials. And what this allows us to do is take that ND response and project it onto an interpretable 1D encoding axis. So at any given moment in time, we can understand to what extent the population is encoding A versus X. Okay, so likewise, we can do the same thing for the C/C prime classifier. So this is the exact same firing rate activity, but now I'm grouping trials by whether the animal heard C or C prime. This time I'm taking the average firing rate during the C/C prime presentation, and again, building an encoding axis. So as you can probably tell from just the firing rate responses, auditory cortex unsurprisingly represents sounds that are being played. And so the question is, does it represent the predictions or the associations between those sounds? So what I'm going to show you next is projections of the ND activity into a state space defined by the AX sensory axis and the C/C prime axis. And we're going to start basically at the beginning, looking at all the activity from day 1 at the very beginning of the sequence when A or X is played. So just to remind you, A should be encoded on the left and X should be encoded on the right. So an example condition, here's an example X condition. You see that X is correctly encoded on the right. And likewise, A is correctly encoded on the left. And the same is true for our other conditions because, like I said, it's the beginning of the sequence, so the animal hasn't heard C or C prime. So let's look at day 4 after the animal has experienced the sounds, and you'll notice the trajectories happen at an angle. So what I mean by this, for example, if you look at the blue and green trajectories, this is when X is played. They move to the right, but they also move up. In other words, they're encoding C prime when X is played. And likewise, when A is played, we see an encoding of C. In other words, there's a prediction of C or C prime when the AX stimulus comes on at the very beginning of the sequence. So we wanted to just understand and basically confirm this relationship between the two encoding axes. So what I did is I looked at the angle between the hyperplanes, and on day 1, it's around 90 degrees, and this significantly decreases over days. So the angle is acute, and this means that when activity moves along one axis, it also moves along the other. Okay, so the next question is, how does this affect what the activity looks like later on in the sequence? So again, we're looking at day 4, and I've paused this video right before the C/C prime comes on. And you can see that A trials are correctly encoded on the left, and likewise, X trials are on the right. So now the question is, what happens when an unexpected stimulus plays? So I encourage you to look at either the pink or green trials. And basically what you'll see is that when, like for example, when C prime comes on unexpectedly, in other words, the sequence started with A, the population was initially correctly encoding A, and then it crosses over to encode X when C prime is played. And we see the reverse when C is unexpectedly played after X. Meanwhile, the expected trials are correctly encoded. So in other words, that connection between A and C prime and X is so strong that when you have the onset of the C/C prime, that overwrites that AX sensory encoding. And this is basically a post-diction.
Can I just like quickly ask, is it also that even like they're being separated much stronger than in the beginning, right? Is that the case? So I mean, when they switch the different directions, they're actually going farther, right? In terms of the representation, the separation of the two sounds.
Do you mean the representation of A and X, or C and C prime?
Well, I mean, like when we follow like the green, for example, one, so it kind of like it is in the upper right, but it's not really like so far in the upper right quadrant. But then when it shifts to lower left, it's really farther, right?
Like the green is, oh, yeah. So
yeah.
I think sort of what you're getting at is the fact that right before C/C prime comes on, the encoding of AX isn't that strong along the AX sensory axis. So later on in the presentation, I'm going to show sort of like the extent to which the encoding is correct along that axis. And relative, you're correct, like relative to where it is right before C comes on, it does move a lot when C/C prime comes on. But if you look at the 1D projections, which I can also show you after the presentation, it's generally the same amount of encoding as was during the AX period.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. So like kind of like, it seems like it's, let's ignore for now like this placement, whether like it's close to zero or like farther from zero, right? That's what you're saying. The encoding could be normalized.
Essentially, I mean, yeah, I think so. I think that's the right intuition to have. Okay, so basically what I was saying is we're calling this phenomenon a post-diction because other people have sort of talked about that word with respect to anytime your memory of the past is altered to fit what's happening in the present. So just to review, we see this alignment of representations. So here I'm showing again, like the angle between AX sensory and C/C prime sensory, this time over within day and across days. And as you can tell, the angle between these two axes decreased over time. And this led to a prediction, which is really helpful because predictions can compensate for partial information and let you predict the future. And it also led to a postdiction, or an overwriting of the past to fit the present. Now, postdiction, I think, generally sounds bad. I think we should remember the times where it's good. You know, maybe you spaced out in this presentation already, I don't know. But if you generally know things about neuroscience and computation, you can sort of fill in the blanks, right, based on what I'm saying now. Or, you know, if you step into a movie late, you can imagine what happened at the beginning. Of course, it's also been known to lead to optical illusions. And anecdotally, we all know that some people like to have creative retellings of the past. So I think it's really interesting that it's possible that this alignment mechanism can explain both these phenomenon. Okay, so back to my original question, which is how is the short-term memory maintained? So in the firing rate activity during that C/C prime period, is there any information about whether A or X was played? So to get at this question, we take the firing rate activity during C/C prime, and we train a classifier to distinguish between the A and the X trials. So I'm going to plot the same state space as before, but this time I'm going to put the AX memory axis on the bottom and C/C prime on the y-axis. And again, I'm going to look at day 4 during the presentation of C/C prime. And basically what you see is that despite the fact the animal has learned these predictions, along the memory axis, the encoding for A and X is preserved. And unsurprisingly, if we look at the relationship between the memory and the sensory axis, we find that over time, by day 4, it's about orthogonal. So what I want to hammer home is that this AX information transforms over the course of the sequence. And I hope this will get at your question, which is sort of like, where does information lie along these axes over the course of the sequence? So what I'm going to plot on the y-axis here is the extent to which AX information is correctly encoded. Okay, and so I'm going to, for example, we'll start with the AX sensory axis. So like you were saying earlier, it is really strongly encoded during the AX period, and then it drops down over time. And then the reason that it's basically at chance at C/C prime is this includes both trial types. So if I had broken it up by expected, unexpected, one would be above chance and one would be below chance. Meanwhile, if we look at the AX memory axis over the course of the sequence, we can see it starts low and then increases over time. And so you can tell that the information about whether A or X was played or is being played moves over time. And this is really important. Like I said, you have that alignment between the two sensory axes that leads to prediction and postdiction, but the transformation over time allows the AX memory axis to be orthogonal to C/C prime sensory, and that is why the short-term memory of AX is preserved. Okay, so then the question becomes, how does that transformation happen over time? Okay, so I'm going to go into mechanisms of orthogonalization. We did a bit more work on this, but I want to give a general overview, and then if there's more questions, I'm happy to talk more about it. So the first obvious way to separate representations between the sensory and the memory period is independence, or just different sets of neurons represent the AX information during the sensory period. So we have some set of neurons representing AX during the sensory period, and then a completely different set of neurons representing that information during the memory period or the C/C prime period. Alternatively, we could have a population level representation. And so what this would require is you have some subset of neurons that represent the AX information during the sensory period. Okay, so they have selectivity to ARX, and that's sort of shown here in purple and green. And they change their selectivity over the course of the trial such that the sensory axis rotates into a memory axis that's able to avoid any interference. So the next question is, we just want to look at the neural activity and understand how neurons change their selectivity over time. So what we do is we look at any given neuron and their firing rate response to A, shown in purple, and X, shown in green. And from this, we can calculate a z-scored firing rate difference. And so this basically tells you the selectivity or the preference of the neuron at any given moment in the sequence. So for example, this one prefers A throughout the sequence. And we can do this for all of the neurons that we recorded across all of our animals. And we cluster this, and from the clustering, we found 4 different clusters, and they fall into 2 neuron categories. The first category are stable neurons that sustain their selectivity over the course of the sequence. And the second type of neurons were switching neurons that switch their selectivity after AX. So in other words, by the time the memory period is on, they've changed their selectivity. So I wanted to first check that these neurons significantly contribute to the axes. So I looked at the AX sensory axis and I asked basically if stable and switching neurons were significantly selective during the sensory period. And in this graph, the none neurons are just neurons that aren't selective to A or X. And it's not surprising that not all neurons in auditory cortex care about all sounds, right? So we just wanted to focus on neurons that are selective to A and X. Then if we look at the memory period, sorry, what we see is, again, stable and switching neurons contribute to the memory axis. And their contribution, or like the direction of those classifier weights, is in the same direction during both the memory and the sensory period for the stable neurons. But the switching neurons contribute weights in opposite directions to the sensory and the memory periods. Okay, so I'm going to show you how that completes the rotation. And to do so, I'm going to plot the activity of stable and switching neurons over the course of the sequence. Okay, so on the x-axis is the preference of stable neurons. And on the y-axis is the preference of switching neurons. So I'm going to start at just looking at what happens when A or X is played. And basically, X preferring neurons are shown in green, and A preferring neurons are shown in purple. And when the sound is played, you can see that their selectivity increases over time, and this is what helps build that AX sensory axis, right? This is what allows there to be information to like train your classifier. All right, so how does the information change over the course of the sequence? So what you can see is that stable neurons maintain their selectivity, but switching neurons switch. So like if you're following the green trajectory, you can tell, okay, these neurons initially preferred X. So they started in the upper, the upper right corner, and then they drop down. And that means that they initially preferred X, and then by the time C or C prime turns on, they now prefer A, and vice versa for neurons that initially preferred A. And what this does is as you can see, it rotates the axis so that when C or C prime plays, the encoding for memory can avoid any interference from that immediate sensory input of C or C prime. So in conclusion, we have this paradigm that has these embedded predictable sequences, and we found that when the mice listened to them, it aligned their sensory representations between the AX and the C/C prime stimuli. And this basically let the animal represent a prediction of whether C or C prime was most likely going to be played at the beginning of the sequence. But this alignment causes an overwrite of the AX sensory information when the C or C prime comes on unexpectedly. So in other words, if you had an area of the brain that was using that initial AX sensory axis to decode the memory, it would fail on unexpected trials. However, at the same time, the AX information is preserved along an orthogonal axis. In other words, there's still an accurate readout of AX memory. And this occurs because you have this dynamic transformation of AX information over the course of the sequence. And that transformation is largely supported by both stable and switching neurons. Okay, so that's all I have. And I just wanted to thank you for listening. And I wanted to thank my lab, especially Tim. He's been a huge part of this project. And yeah, super supportive. Thank you so much.